Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Welcome to my video on writing a methods section for an APA-style manuscript. The publication manual of the American Psychological Association recommends breaking the methods section of a manuscript down into subheadings. Which subheadings are selected are up to the authors that are writing the manuscript, and the authors will decide on which subheadings to use based on several factors like the type of study, the participants, how many and what type of instruments were used, as well as many other factors. I like to use 4 subheadings for most of the papers I write, and it's important to understand this is just the way that I like to format it. Once I have these 4 sections in place, sometimes I will divide one of these sections into 2 subheadings, or I'll simply add another heading in the mixture. But where I like to start is with participants, procedure, measures, and statistical analysis. So these are the 4 sections I'm going to be talking about in this video. But understand that your manuscript may need more or possibly fewer headings than this. I do feel that this is the minimum. I think these 4 do represent the minimum. I can imagine there would be studies that may just require 3 subheadings as opposed to 4. But I feel this is a good place to start at 4, and then if you feel for clarity or to make the structure as understandable as possible, you need to add subheadings, that's fine. I just feel like this is a good place to start. So let's start with participants. First, to understand in general, the participants section is a description of the sample, of the participants that were active in the study. I like to make a note about the geography without being very specific. For example, you wouldn't want to put the city and state where the study took place, but just the general geographic region, like the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States. I like to include a lot of demographic information, and I think it's important to recognize that we also want to include demographic information that we may not necessarily think is relevant to the study. But if you collect the demographic information, I feel it's important to include it. It gives the reader a better picture of the demographic characteristics of the participants. So some examples of demographic characteristics that you would want to include would be gender, age, race, ethnicity, education level, religious beliefs, disability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, immigration status, familial status, language preference, and employment career status. Now, it is important to be aware you might not have access to all these demographic characteristics depending on how you set up your data collection. But if you can gather all these demographic characteristics and include them in the participant section, I think that is the most logical way to build that part of the participant section. Other information you want to include is if your study, now in counseling oftentimes this is true, if your study involves disorders, for example disorders from the DSM-5, you want to include that information. For example, if you sampled participants that suffer from major depressive disorder, you'd want to record that in the participants section. Sometimes at the beginning of a study, we don't know what the disorders are, but we do know what the symptoms are. In that case, you would record the symptoms that were prevalent in the sample. So moving on to procedure. Now, before I start discussing this part of procedure, I want to make you aware that it's not uncommon that the items listed on this slide are often included in the participants section. Again, it's up to the authors that are writing a particular manuscript, but I like to put these items most of the time in the procedure section. However, I've also put them in the participant section on occasion. Again, it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish in terms of the structure of paper. So I have this listed as these items as to be recorded under the procedure section, but be aware they would be at home in the participant section as well. So items here for either the last part of the participant section or the first part of the procedure section would be sampling method. So how did you sample the population? What method did you use? The sample size, and you want to describe how that sample size was determined in relation to, for example, any hypotheses that you're testing. You want to demonstrate that your sample size is adequate. You want to have inclusion and exclusion criteria listed here. So perhaps for a particular study in counseling, an inclusion criteria would be that a participant has to be over 18 but under 70 years old. So there could be an age range. Or an exclusion criteria could be that a person cannot have active psychotic symptoms, or they can't be under the influence of any type of drug, including alcohol. Then you want to have your participation and attrition rates. So participation rate would include something like if you sampled, say, 500 participants or potential participants, and 100 decide to participate in the study. So that's a participation rate of 20%. And it's also important to note the attrition rate. So in almost every study, especially studies that have an extended length of time they cover, participants drop out for a number of reasons, and you want to include that attrition rate. It's important to note with the attrition rate that you want not just the total attrition rate, for example, how many participants dropped out throughout the whole study, but you may want to include specific intervals in the attrition rate for those intervals. For example, maybe you lost, out of 100 participants, maybe you lost 10 in the first 30 days, but only 5 in the next 30 days, and you had no losses for the remainder of the study. You might want to break it down that way depending on the type of study you have. If compensation of any type was involved, you want to record that. And of course, there's other procedural elements that you want to include regarding the IRB approval, the informed consent the participants signed, and you want to detail how you maintained ethics and how you provided for the safety of the participants. So moving on to procedure continued. So these would be elements that I would, in almost every case, put in the procedure section. So none of these elements would be in the participant section. The only possible other location for these elements would be if you broke this procedure section into subheadings. So what you would want here is a step-by-step description of what the participants and researchers experienced. So as you begin to write the procedure section, or specifically this part of the procedure section, I think it's valuable to reflect on what was the experience of the participants, or each group of participants, from when they were first introduced to the idea of participating in your study, all the way through to when the study was complete. And similarly, what did the researchers experience? And why I think this is important is because you want to make sure in your method section that you provide enough information for another author or authors to replicate your study. And oftentimes there are many details that would be easy to leave out of a procedure section that are important for replication. So here you want to include the setting. Now this is different than the geography that I was talking about before. The setting would be, for example, a community mental health clinic. You want to record the setting and describe the setting. Not in a lot of detail, because you don't want a reader to be able to identify, in many cases, you don't want them to be able to identify the specific agency that was being referred to. A lot of times that remains anonymous. But you want to give a general idea of what the setting is like. You want to talk about the instructions that the participants received. Again, this is thinking about the step-by-step, what happened with the participants from the beginning of the study to the end. You want to record any unexpected occurrences that may have happened during the study. In terms of internal threats to validity, this is called a history threat to validity. And these are unexpected events that could have an impact on the outcome. For example, if you were conducting a study in the summer in an area that where the temperature was fairly warm in the summer, and for a week out of, say, a 4-week study, the air conditioning was disabled, you'd want to mention that because the participants would probably be uncomfortably hot. Right? That's not something you planned on, but it happened and it could affect the outcome, so you want to make sure you include that. You want to talk about the research design, and there's a lot of elements here. You really want to capture not just the essence of the research design, but really even the detail. What design did you use? What type of groups were there? Did you divide the participants into groups? What type of assignment did you use if you did divide them into groups? Random assignment? Or was there some other method used to assign them to groups? Was it a between or within subjects design? Now sometimes designs are both between and within subjects, so you'd want to make sure you record that. Record the sequence of how the treatment was delivered. So if you have 3 treatments, what sequence were they delivered in? And the timing. Was one treatment delivered on 1 week and another treatment 2 weeks later or a month later? You want to include that as well. Additionally, you want to document the specific name of the research design or designs used. For example, true experimental design, quasi-experimental, 2-group post-test design, Solomon 4-group design. So you're going to want to make sure you detail that as well in this section. You want to talk about the independent variables and any manipulation that occurred using the independent variables. So some independent variables are independent, but we don't manipulate them, and some are independent and we do manipulate them. So an example of an independent variable that we can't manipulate would be age or gender. We can't assign somebody to a gender, we can't assign somebody to be a certain age. But other independent variables we do manipulate. For example, we put somebody into a CBT group counseling session or a series of sessions, or individual existential counseling, and other participants we don't. They're placed in a control group. So treatment type, in that sense, would be an independent variable that we manipulate. Also, any covariates that were included in the study, we want to make sure we talk about what those are and why we included them. We want to describe the dependent variables. Now, the dependent variables are the variables that we measure. They're the outcome variables. And oftentimes, these are scores on instruments. So you may have a treatment, that would be an independent variable, and then you'd have an assessment that participants take, and they receive a certain score, and that's your dependent variable. Now, it's important to note here that oftentimes we collect a lot of data, but not all of that data is used in every study. So if you have 3 dependent variables in a particular study, but you're only focusing on one for a specific manuscript, you still have to indicate that the other measures were given. That's important because that could influence how participants responded. For example, if you were delivering, say, 5 instruments that took an hour and a half, and you were only reporting on the last instrument that was given, well, the fact that the participants had all that time taking the 4 instruments prior to the one you're reporting on, that could have an impact on how they scored on the last instrument. There's a testing effect. So we need to report all the dependent variables regardless of whether they're included in the current manuscript. So then moving on to measures. So when I discussed dependent variables at the end of the previous slide, in the procedure section, you're going to be listing the dependent variables, but you're not going to be providing a detailed description of each dependent variable, of each instrument that you used. In the measures section, you will be. You want to include the instrument name or names, the psychometric data of the instruments, for example, the reliability and the validity. And you want to show how there's cultural validity for the cultures represented in your participant groups. You also want to discuss the format of the measures. Are they self-report? Are they clinician or computer administered? How many items are in each instrument? What are the scales that the instruments are supposed to be measuring? You also want to detail the response format for each instrument that you'll be using. And there are several different response formats that we see in counseling instruments, in appraisal instruments. Likert scales, some are open-ended, so it'll be a question and the participant will write a narrative after each question. Symptom checklists often use like a 0 through 3 or a 0 through 4 type format, where the 0 represents no symptoms in the last 2 weeks, and the 3 could represent a lot of symptoms in the last 2 weeks. So in instances like that, where you have a numeric selection that the client makes on an instrument, make sure to list what each number represents. And you also want to include a brief history of each of the instruments. Who developed the instrument? How is the instrument used? What have other studies indicated about the instrument? And typically this isn't extended, it's just a brief history, but it's important to include this so the reader understands where the instruments came from and how they were developed. Then we have the Statistical Analysis section. And in this section you have a description of the statistical analyses used in the study. Now it's important to note here that some authors do not have this section, and they include the items that I'm going to discuss here in the beginning portion of the results section. I prefer to have a separate section as part of the method that discusses the statistical analyses. In this section, no results are reported. This is strictly just what statistics were used in analyzing the data. So you have descriptive statistics, mean, median, mode, standard deviation, range. You have inferential statistics, like a t-test or a paired t-test, paired sample t-test, ANOVA, and I list ANOVA, that could also be ANCOVA, MONOVA, MANCOVA, repeated measures ANOVA, chi-square, linear regression. So there's a lot to choose from in terms of inferential statistics. And remember, in this section, you're just listing the actual statistical analytical procedure. So, for example, with ANOVA, you would list the calculations that you performed to meet the assumptions for ANOVA, how you actually conducted the ANOVA, what the independent variables were in the ANOVA, what the dependent variable was, but you're not providing any results. You're not providing the result of running the statistic, but just what statistic you ran and how you ran it. You also want to include the software used to calculate the statistics. Now, oftentimes that's SPSS. I also like to include Excel because I use Excel to format the data and then I import it into SPSS because I find that to be more efficient and an easier way to do it. Also, I find it's easier to collect data in Excel. So I record usually both software packages because I usually use both. But really, you're just recording what you use. So if you only use SPSS, that's the software you would list at the end of the statistical analysis section. And this section is the last section of the method section. It's the last subheading in the method section. Remember that you can add or subtract sections based on your needs and the needs of your particular study. But I think the format that I use here, I'll move back up to that, participants, procedure, measures, and statistical analysis, is a good place to start. And then from here, if you want to make modifications, I find it's easier to make them in this framework. I hope you found this video to be helpful. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to assist you.